Thank you, Courtney, for bringing such an interesting group of artists together. There's quite a really interesting range here. I guess that, this range made me think about the idea of public, because we are here to talk about public art, but we have artists that are using site-specific land works, people who are doing things in public institutions, people who are doing things about forums and activism, and so I was thinking about the term public, which is essentially a very political term. Public defines, it has a democratic spirit to it. We are the public. Public places and public things are accessible to us, they're responsible to us, and they're owned by us. So I was thinking about how you guys were defining public, and is it a relationship about space or place or forums or community, and what the political implications of that are.
Yeah, I guess we can maybe speak to that a little bit. I think for us, we had to define a public because we were working in one of the most geopolitically contested spaces in the Western Hemisphere, and there's a lot of disunity in that region, and so we're working with a lot of rival stakeholders. And so we need to reimagine a public, one where people could come together across differences in order for us to broker a period and zone of safety in order to create, make what was seemingly impossible a reality. And so I think a lot of times when for us, in the case of our work, when we think about the public, we think about the work we need to do to help catalyze the organization of a public and the formation of a public.
Mm-hmm. But your work also really resonates with this idea of public land too, right?
Well, the repellent fence was half on public land and half on private land. And so we had to broker permissions on public land. We also had to broker permissions on private land. But even though lands are public, for example, the site where we installed repellent fence is, you have private landowners, but then you have people who work the land who have just as much ownership over it, like cartels, like coyotes, like Border Patrol. So we had to work through all of like those contexts. We had to use those contexts to help catalyze this public that I'm talking about, which is one that is more productive, that might have a greater capacity for dialogue. And not bipartisan debate, but dialogue.
Yeah, I think in that same nature, one of the things that we think a lot about is that, of course, public is inherently political, and we each bring our own relationship to what that is. And working with something that has the word public in it, a public library, we don't escape the publicness of it. But that means that all of us have a role and a relationship to what that publicness means. And you can see, and we're talking about one building. And in its very bones, it holds the histories of not being a public space, even though it's consistently asserted public. So that's a consistent violence that continues to happen. And so I think one of the things that we think about a lot in the library is how do you make those things more explicit? Because yes, we're not interested in erasing the history, bringing the history to the front. Reimagining, I think thinking about imagery is so important. But without making who's making consistent choices, working towards more transparency around how things are structured. All of these things are acts about making the publicness more active.
It seems as though that we're looking at artists and artists who work in the public as something separate. But when in fact, we're all part of the public, as you stated. And so artists are multifaceted, and the mere fact that we're making art makes it public.
Again, do you have any thoughts?
I think about who's not considered part of the public, the unauthorized and the unrecognized. So unauthorized migrants, undocumented people, are not viewed as taxpayers or as citizens, and yet they are such an inherent part of our economy, but they are disregarded, just like even though many black people have citizenship in this country, citizenship doesn't mean anything. Every 28 hours, there's a black person killed by the police. So it doesn't guarantee recognition. There's the unauthorized and the unrecognized. And I think when we talk about public, we have to really look at how loaded. There's a lot of assumptions around who belongs and who doesn't. I mean, the conversation on public bathrooms and the gender binary that people want to insist on is, I think, a big, it tells us how the word public or public spaces are still, there's still a lot of power dynamics going on in there.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, the idea of public is an idea of a community. It's a we,
Right.
you know? But there are lots of different kinds of publics, you know? And I'd be interested to know how you guys engage or activate or empower these different types of communities. Yeah.
I feel like and maybe it's because of our, like in the U.S., like emphasis on individual property, but whenever I'm in a public space, it doesn't feel like it's mine. It feels like it's nobody's. And so there's sort of like this invisible authority that dwells in this space, and I always see signage about what I can't do,
Right.
but I don't have a sense of what I can do.
Right,
And so
right.
you tend to find these places that are kind of dirty because nobody feels a personal ownership. And to me personally, that's a challenge to create a sense of communal ownership. And it translates into my work as a challenge to create distributed authorship. And so I just needed to add that in there because I feel like if it's public, then it's nobody's.
Right, 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 right.
And I guess that's part of the challenge of imagining a new public, what it means to be public.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
I think part of what it means to be a new public is to recognize that we're on Indian lands.
That's right.
And
Thank you.
and so that's the dimension that we're trying to bring. That's the lens we're trying to bring to the discussion, because our peoples are oftentimes left out of public discourse, and there are very complicated reasons for why that happens. But people are labeled as illegals. One of the reasons why we did our work is because we find it interesting how indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere are now illegal. And when what's happening is that people are just following the old indigenous trade routes that have been honored since time immemorial. And so that's the memory of that we're trying to bring back, because the immigration narrative is trying to force us into a Genesis amnesia about ourselves.
I like what you're saying about the possibility of nobody owning a public art piece, but I fear then who are you leaving it open to grab it if nobody claims it? So we thought about this problem in the repellent fence, and what seemed to happen, what seemed to work itself out is that all the way from the top, you had people who worked for the city of Agua Prieta and Douglas, the mayor, all the way down to people who who are in a rehab facility in Agua Prieta volunteering to work on this project, and all of them being able to claim the piece for the sister cities. So in that way, we really did want to acknowledge that it was, that was their piece. And if you came from Bisbee, which is the more affluent artist community up the hill, it wasn't necessarily your piece, but you were welcome to come hang out and check it out with everybody. But we wanted to be careful that it was claimed.
Yeah, that people are positioned as guests, but that there's stewardship, because you're building an instrument, you're building a tool. And so when you build a tool like that, there has to be accountability and responsibility. So this idea of maybe not ownership, but stewardship is really important. That relationality, it changes reality, because once people began the work of stewardship, they began telling stories of their indigeneity, because it's a mestizo people in that area.
And I would add, I mean, one of the things I really loved about your project, and if we imagine that the border is a fairly recent man-made invention that people attach value to and follow. And so it feels very solid, and yet there's so much porousness to it, like in places like El Paso and in Juarez and where you were at, where actually the porousness is making the communities thrive. I mean, Tijuana now has a border that's on both sides of the border because they realize that it's better for them to be in conversation. And so I love how, like, that you're inviting people to actually ignore this static, solid thing, and to, what you said is to create a new memory. I feel like that was just really powerful in terms of, like that it's really our home, it's our community.
And it's a tension, because the fence, a reimagination of a fence, is mitigating, on the one hand, the power of a border, but at the same time, it does that by acknowledging the presence of it. And so then now asking the question, well, it's here, it's not going to go away, so how do we instrumentalize it? How do we use it as a tool and activate that tool for our own local community self-determination?
This kind of thing is just happening. The unfortunate thing, it's nothing new. And this whole notion of borders is a myth.
Right.
I mean, because when you're in space, you don't see these borders. And the same thing about race. Race is a social construct.
That's right. Yes.
And it's a myth. And I think that as we as artists have to continuously make this a part of the dialogue and make the invisible visible. I mean, if you look at Africa today, and when it was divided up, was it in the 30s? But it went on through the 30s. And now you see what's happening. I mean, it's just totally ridiculous. And then we have people like Trump, who's the biggest asshole around. Yeah.
I think one other thing that's interesting about the word public is relating to the fact that it is commodified, and our system of capitalism is that public has also become a bad word. Like, public has been erased from many, many things. I just wanted to point that out, that in some ways the word public is also dangerous. And I do think that public calls upon us to have some kind of accountability to each other and at least answerability.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about, if you think about museums as public institutions, artists have had a long critique of museums, going back to Alan Capro, Andrea Fraser, and I mean, they are public institutions, but I think that you guys are all engaged in some sort of public critique, even by existing outside the museum or gallery, or directly with institutions sometimes, perhaps. I was wondering if you guys could speak to that.
I think we need to work with whatever means that's necessary. I mean, because we are a part of it, whether we admit to it or not. And in order to exist as artists, we do have to make a living.
Yes.
And sometimes we have to use those arenas to talk about the issues that are meaningful to all of us.
And I would add, I think that artists have I think in looking forward, I think that what the social justice sector can do is actually make more space for artists. Because if you think about, well, who does the social justice sector hire? They hire press people, they hire grassroots organizers, faith organizers, project managers, and yet you hardly see them hire artists. And yet we are such a critical part of what change looks like. I mean, without cultural change, you won't have policy change. So I think that we also need to understand that the role of the artist is in all, sectors of public life, especially in the change-making space.
And I wanted to talk to Transfer Museum. You guys are collaborating with a public institution, but also critiquing it in a way.
I don't know if we're critiquing the library. I think that we are working with the patrons of the library. I'm not afraid of critique. I love critique, first of all. I just want to say. But I think that it is one of the things is that our collaboration as Transformasium has very much evolved over time to be employees of the library. And we're very aware of that. I think that one of the things that we think a lot about in terms of different kinds of institutions is how do you challenge each other's capacity and also make sure that when a museum is approaching you to do a project or that everyone is coming from a different value system and has a different kind of set of ideas around what's labor, what's visible labor, what's valued, what the work is, who the cultural producers are that get to paid, all of these things. And so one of the things that we do with the library as a public institution is we are able to create paid positions, for instance, for different kinds of cultural workers that otherwise wouldn't be hired necessarily by a museum that has a standard for who their cultural workers are. And so because of the library, we're also able to leverage foundation money because we have a larger kind of institution around us. We're not just artists saying, hey, this is, so I think we think a lot about that.
I really believe in that we as artists have to build institutions. I mean, my family from the East Side Arts Alliance is here. We built that in response to there not being cultural institutions in Oakland run by people of color, from the lake to 100th Avenue, no cultural institutions. And that was just horrendous. So we organized and we created an institution and we bought a building so that we don't have to be evicted. So I think that part of what artists have to do, and I run a national organization that gets a lot of foundation funding, and really that I think we have to be especially unafraid of money and of resources because institutions are going to surpass us. I mean, institutions allows us to give people health insurance, it allows for job stability, it allows us to hire whoever we want, to really implement this vision that's a long-term vision. And I always challenge artists because I think sometimes, as artists, we have a little bit of our internalized oppression tells us that we can't build our own businesses. But I really think that that's how we're going to be able to have sustainability is by building institutions. And if we even think about, the Chicano arts movement, the Black arts movement, I mean, their institutions, many of them were decimated. So our generation didn't necessarily get to inherit that and really thinking about longevity, like how do we own things, how do we own our intellectual property, for the long term.
Great. Anyone else?
I just want to re-emphasize that it was such an amazing gift to come into this library that had been on the verge of being demolished, and it is a giant ornate stone building, and it was going to be torn down. And that it was built back up from a community by people who were not afraid of long-term work, who worked for decades. So that foundation really changed that public library into something very different than what Andrew Carnegie built. And we are so fortunate to be in that space and to try to continue that long-term, very slow, intentional work.
And y'all had support from your mayor too, right? Like, did you? Oh, I thought I saw your mayor somewhere. Oh, maybe that was
yeah. Okay. there are many,
There are many strategies for neighborhood development.
we do not share his.
We are interested in multiplicity of strategies.
I think we forget how powerful we are as artists.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about the visual artists, I'm talking about all the artists. And in order for us to make really a big impact on society, I mean, we really have to work together. I mean, the day without art could be really powerful if it was really a day without art.
Well, I think at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions from the audience.
The book lists that you showed from the library, are those available online? Because every single one of them, I thought, I want to read every one of those books, and I couldn't write them down fast enough.
We haven't. We have not done that yet. We did do a project that we didn't show where we made posters of all the books that I purchased over the year that I was purchasing, and we would love to make that available. We'd love to make all the book lists available. It's really new for us, this valuing that work as a project. So. Yeah, and I think that as we invite more artists and curators and educators to participate, it'll just grow. And I mean, I can't imagine how amazing it will be. But yeah, we'd love to do that.
We'll make them public.
Where did they find the winged messenger statue, the FBI?
It was so many of the valuable objects that were in the library, like a chandelier and the pipe organ and that kind of stuff, were stolen by this guy, Joey Nimitz, who is like a construction guy, and he kind of just carted them off. And he was able to sell them, kind of slowly. But I guess it's really hard to sell a big sculpture like that. So they were able to catch him by tracing his attempts to sell it at auction.
I just want to thank each of you. Your presentations were exponential and kind of expanding, and I think we're so inspired as creatives and artists. I wanted to also just acknowledge that there's so much space and time and the relationships that were created throughout these projects. So, this format, we are allowed to kind of get rid of space and time and just put everything into one, but there's so much time and space that was really allowed to make this happen, and I really want to applaud you for that. And I'm wondering, as a fellow artist, what are your next projects, and what is your departure point now? Where are you at in your own practice? And just give us a little glimpse of where you're headed.
Which part of our life do you want to know? Well, I'm working now with 3 other artists on the AC Transit corridor, which starts at downtown Oakland by the old Catwells. Now it's Uber and goes through San Leandro. And so we are doing all the bus kiosks, the railings, and that part of my life. And then there's several other parts. And so we had to meet with every community to get a common thread that runs through all of these neighborhoods. International Boulevard, former East 14th or 14th Street, is actually like a highway that many people don't know about. And it's one of the most diverse streets in the East Bay. And so one of the things we want to do is to acknowledge that, so that those people who live along the corridor, those people who make their living, are not forgotten. What's happening with this is that many artists are getting displaced, including myself. My studio of 17 years, the rent is going up 50%. So And it's happening all over. So I'm not alone in this.
Hi, so I kind of have a philosophical question. I guess it might be where you find the courage to have faith in your vision and your imagination for the future as an artist, and how you then balance that with this commitment that clearly all of you have made to responsiveness and dialogue with communities. And just what is that struggle for you?
Is it a choice? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the values of working in a collective, is we draw courage from each other to think of projects and to filter ourselves and to just find solutions to do these things. And having that filter is really helpful, because it keeps you careful and respectful, and it keeps you, it keeps you safe, I guess, and especially in this project. There were a lot of things that could have gone wrong, and we really, thought that out amongst us. So that's one of the reasons we work together, and like Ghana think tank was saying, those disagreements help make that happen.
I think on the durational piece that you brought up as well, the slowness of all of these projects, is there's this incredible tension between the urgency and the slowness. And the duration of these projects and how slow, and it's our life. And that's the part about choice that's a question. Also is interrupting systems of like rapid movement and kind of the capitalist idea of like that things have to change overnight, and that you do these things, and as long as you have money you can make it happen. And I think that, so the slowness is a piece of it, but balancing that with the urgency of what we're responding to every day is challenging. Yeah. But again, I think there's a reason why all of us up here have different forms of collaboration. I think that's really a true point.
I think something that, I don't know if this is getting to your question, but your question made me think a lot about, one of the things I think about is how there's a lot of polarizing rhetorics that are defining publics right now, all around the world. And being here makes me wonder to what degree we have the capacity as artists to extend beyond those rhetorics. And because a lot of times, I think in arts, a lot of times we're preaching to the choir. And that actually is a system of control in a capitalist structure. And so what gets me up in the morning and what helps me find some peace or some balance is this intense desire. We all share this. We talk about this a lot in post-commodity, which is to mediate complexity by generating confusion, because we feel that is through expressions of confusion and noise that we can trick the system into more nuanced and productive dialogues. And that's something that I think is really important to stress. And that's why we have a piece called Repellent Fence. Well, what is it repelling? Is it repelling migrants? Is it repelling the Border Patrol? Is it the eye upon itself? Is it the eye that is repelling, or is it the eye that is aware, that has that is conscious, or represents social consciousness? Those types of questions, those types of oppositional or confusing questions are strategies that we try to use, because we could have never achieved a work like that if it was just going to represent one side of the discourse. They would have never, the people who live in the region, whether whoever thinks they're good guys or bad guys, it's not, it wouldn't have been possible without everyone's cooperation. So I think that's really important to note.
I would like to add that being an artist helps me be an emancipated human being, and in my imagination, I'm emancipated. And I think that that's extremely critical, especially for people who have been affected by gender violence or by immigration. I also think that art is a very healing thing for our communities. And in a lot of ways, for me, art helped me come out about my abortion. It helped me begin to do things and have a sense of freedom that no other part of my life afforded me. So I think that fundamentally art is about expression, like really expressing who you are and where you want to go, or imagining also who you want to be. And especially when you live in a culture where you don't see yourself reflected in everyday, I mean, just think about the movies out there, like when was the last time you saw a film with a major Latina protagonist or an Asian woman protagonist? Like that, those are rare, and yet Latinos are 50 million strong in this country, but we're completely invisible. So when you live in a culture where you're continuously invisibilized or stereotyped according to what gender you are, I think it's actually very freeing to have a practice where you can be anything you want to be. You can be something on your own terms, and on top of that, you create output that gives other people permission to be whoever they want to be. And you provide solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing. So I think, for me, art has been such a gift. It's really, I think, it's about our desire as human beings to want to have full freedom.
Well, I think that art is one of the last frontiers from freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And I really don't want to lose that.
Yeah.
And for me, it gives me that avenue to talk about issues not only that are important to me, but to others. And when I think about these, again, about the borders and what's happening with the pipeline going and dealing with native land and the borders, I mean, we have to speak out. We have to address all of these issues.
Well, I think we're out of time now. I want to thank the panelists and Courtney King.